Last week we concluded our discussion of the subject of Maya. Maya is that mysterious but powerful phenomenon that causes us jivas, individual souls, to perceive things, to see things erroneously, wrongly, to see ourselves as separate from other jivas, from the world and from God. When the upadhis are the limiting factors, when these are removed, what we call the jiva is seen to be identical with Brahman. And this is the conclusion of Advaita Vedanta. Now, it's not just a mere logical conclusion that the jiva is identical with Brahman. It is, in fact, the highest teaching, the supreme teaching of the Veda. The ultimate identity of the soul and God, jiva and Brahman, that is established by four great Vedic statements known as the Mahavakyas. Tattvamasi, that thou art. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. Ayamatma Brahma, this self is Brahman. And Prajnanam Brahma, Brahman is consciousness. All of us have heard these four great utterances. Vedanta teachers say, when you contemplate on the meaning of these statements, then the mind is led from the world of names and forms to Brahman. When you contemplate on the inner meaning of these great statements. All of these statements point to the same fact, that is the ultimate and essential oneness. Ultimate and essential oneness of the jiva, the individual soul, and God, or the supreme soul, the universal soul. The reality behind both of them, between both soul and God, is the absolute Brahman, pure consciousness. This we learned in our last class. But isn't it a fact that the soul is confined to the body? Don't we perceive it like that? Don't we see that the soul is subject to pain and suffering? How can it be identical with the Supreme Self, with the Supreme Infinite Spirit, which is all consciousness and bliss? First of all, it's a mistake to suppose that the soul is in the body. It's a mistake to take it for granted that the soul resides in the body. On the contrary, it would be closer to the truth to say that the body is contained in the soul. Because the subtler a thing is, the more pervasive it is. This body is gross. So as it is, it cannot pervade the soul. On the other hand, it is enveloped, it is covered by the soul, which is infinite, all-pervasive and eternal. So the body is like a vessel, and the soul is like the space inside it and outside. When the vessel is moved from place to place, the space within is not moved. When the contents of the vessel are boiled, the space in it is not boiled. Please think of it. Think about it. I say space is not boiled because space is so subtle that it pervades even heat. Akashad vayuhu, vayor agnihi. So from Akasha comes air. From air comes fire. Similarly, there is something in us that is uncreated, something untouched by sin and suffering. We read in the Upanishads and the Gita, the senses are superior, higher than the body. The mind is superior to the senses. Superior to the mind is the intelligence, buddhi, and superior to the intelligence is he, the self, the indweller. So, what I'm trying to say is, the finer a thing is, the higher it is. But the jiva is surely subject to birth and death. How can it be identical with the infinite and eternal spirit? Sorry again, that is how it appears. The reality is, birth is only the union of the soul with the body, the apparent union of the soul with the body, and death is its separation from the body. The soul in itself is eternal. It is not born and it doesn't die. This we know from the Gita. Then what happens to the soul after it is separated from the body? Does it become one with God? Of course not. Not immediately. It can't become one with God until all its upadhis are removed. Death only removes the grossest upadhi, the physical body. There is still the subtle body and then the causal body containing all our karma, which determines the next body. So all these things have to be removed. When will this happen? When are these upadhis, subtle and causal upadhis, removed? When does the jiva qualify itself for freedom, for moksha? Advaita Vedanta says the soul is already identical with God. It only appears to be subject to upadhis on account of its own ignorance, avidya. Strictly speaking, the soul doesn't need to acquire any new qualifications. It only has to remove its disqualifications. That is the point. Because moksha is not something that is created. Moksha, the state of moksha, if it can be called a state, moksha is eternity, timelessness. It is always there. It is something that is to be realized. So, how is avidya removed then? The straightforward answer is, avidya is removed by its opposite, vidya, jnana. Avidya, as we saw, consists in our imagining that we are separate from one another, separate from the world, from God. All our suffering is due to this avidya or ajnana, to this false notion that we are separate. So the individual soul has to learn to transcend its individuality. How is this done? That brings us to the so-called methods of Vedanta. In this class and the next, we are going to discuss a very important and well-known method of Vedanta, a method by which a seeker of truth realizes the illusory nature of the phenomenal world and arrives at the knowledge of Brahman. It's a twofold method. The first part is known as adhyasa, superimposition in English, Yubalagaram. And the second part is known as apavada, negation, to remove that superimposition. So today we'll be taking up the first part and deal with the second in our next class. Now, Vedanta philosophy describes in great detail the distinction between the seer and the seen, Drik and Drishya. They're also known as the subject and the object, the ego and the non-ego. The seer is the perceiver. It's identical with the subject, the ego. And it has to be conscious and intelligent by nature because it knows. The seen is what is perceived. It is identical with the object. It is the non-ego. So it has to be insentient by nature, unconscious, material. So the seer and the seen are mutually opposed, as Shankaracharya says, opposed like light and darkness. Yet it is a matter of common experience that in everyday practical life we don't distinguish between the two. Through ignorance, avidya, we apply the attributes of the one to the other. The subject is confused with the object. The seen, the seer with the seen, and the object is mistaken for the subject. This mix-up is observable in our daily thought and action. It finds expression in our ordinary speech. This is I, this is mine. The I or the subject is by nature pure consciousness, but we misidentify it with material objects like the body or the mind. Even the mind is material. We'll come to that later. We misidentify it with possessions and belongings. On account of ignorance, we associate the seer with the characteristics of the body. The characteristics of the body are birth, growth, disease, death. We say, I was born, I have grown, I am ill, I am dying. We say all these things. Due to the same ignorance, we associate the seer with the properties of the mind. And we say, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm pleased, I'm annoyed, angry. So discrimination between the seer and the seen is the first qualification for self-knowledge. Viveka. That is the first prerequisite for self-knowledge. The seer, the eternal self, the seer is unchangeable. It has to be pure consciousness, the knowing principle. As I said, that is the subject, the real ego. The seen is what is perceived, whether it is gross or subtle, it is matter. And so it is multiple, and whatever is multiple has to be changeable. How is the seer able to perceive? The seer is able to perceive an object because it is changeless in nature. The eye sees diversity, the diversity of color and form in the outer world. How? Because it is relatively speaking, the I is one and unchanging. The objects that the eye sees, they change more rapidly than the eye does. In turn, the mind, again, relatively speaking, it is one and changeless. The mind is the perceiver of what? The eye's changing characteristics. blindness, dullness of vision, or sharpness of sight. The mind perceives all this. Finally, the mind itself, characterized by thought and desire, the mind itself is an object that is perceived by the self or pure consciousness. This pure consciousness is free from all such changes as birth, growth, decay, or death. If consciousness itself possessed these changing attributes, if consciousness itself possessed them, then there would have to be someone else as their perceiver, or as the perceiver of that consciousness. Who would that perceiver be? Another self? Another consciousness? Then who would be the perceiver of that second consciousness? So you see that the enquiry ends in an infinite regress. The existence of the soul or consciousness can never be a matter of doubt, because the doubter himself is that consciousness. The self cannot be denied because the denier himself is that self. The presence of an undeniable, unbestridbar, the presence of an undeniable self or consciousness has to be assumed. It is assumed in all acts of thinking. So Vedanta states that everything from gross, tangible objects in the outer world up to the body, senses and mind, everything belongs to the category of the seen or the object, and it is all insentient, that is, unconscious, changing. But the self, which is the real seer or subject, that is unchanging consciousness. It can never be imagined to be non-existent. Vedanta says there can never be an absence of consciousness in the knower, because consciousness is the very stuff of the knower. Without consciousness, there cannot be a knower. Now, the method by which we realize the illusory or changing nature of this phenomenal world is what is called superimposition. And that by which we rid ourselves of this illusion and arrive at the knowledge of Brahman, that is called negation. Adhyasa or superimposition and apavada or negation. Superimposition explains how, because of ignorance, one thing appears as another, and the properties of the one is wrongly applied to the other. For example, the idea of a snake, not the snake itself, the idea of a snake is falsely superimposed upon a piece of rope, and the characteristics of the real snake are seen in the rope. In the same manner, the idea of body, senses and mind, which are not the self, is falsely superimposed upon the self. As a result, the self, which is pure consciousness, appears as a phenomenal being, subject to the various limitations of the physical world. So this is why the body, mind, and the ego, the senses, everything is called an adhyasa, a limitation, an upadhi. Because of this same mysterious ignorance, avidya, the qualities of the self are superimposed upon the non-self. And the non-self, something that is material and unconscious, appears to be conscious, intelligent, and full of bliss. It is because of this ignorance that the universe of names and forms appears to have a reality. That is why we can't help mistaking the unreal for the real. While reality is an attribute which actually belongs solely to Brahman. So this is superimposition. Next comes negation. Negation is the method by which we negate. We deny the attributes wrongly superimposed upon a thing and realize its true nature. How do we do it? Through discrimination or discernment, seeing clearly by separating fact from fiction. By negating the attributes of the illusory snake, one discovers what? The true nature of the rope. By negating the attributes of the non-self, that is the body, senses and the mind, we discover the true nature of the self within. And by negating the attributes of the relative world outside, we discover the true nature of Brahman. One important point to be remembered is the attributes, this we heard in our last class also, the attributes that are falsely superimposed upon a thing, that can never affect the thing's true nature. Illusion is illusion. It has no effect upon reality. The illusory snake cannot change the nature of the rope, and in the same way, the superimposed attributes of birth and death, pleasure and pain, these things cannot in any way change the true nature of the self. Reality is not affected by appearance. Now, let us quickly review what we have already learned about Vedanta. Excuse me. As we have seen, the self assumes or appears to assume through Maya a body. It becomes finite and individualized under the effect of ignorance. Under the control of Maya, this embodied soul entertains various desires and binds itself by its own actions. And then, forced by the results of those actions, it takes on different bodies, becomes completely involved in samsara, and it has no choice but to roam about in higher or lower worlds, overcome by the pairs of opposites like good and evil, joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain. All this we have heard several times. This is the nature of the embodied soul. But this individualization, this is neither final nor real, because all the while its immortal self remains perfectly unattached and unaffected. In addition to this physical body, the same individualized soul, the jiva, is also associated with the sense organs, the mind, and the prana, what is usually translated as the vital force or the vital energy. there are 10 sense organs, and all of them are subordinate to the mind, which is technically called the central organ. The 10 sense organs are divided into two groups again. 5 organs of perception and the 5 organs of action, Jnanendriyas and Karmendriyas. The organs of perception, Jnanendriyas, what are they? Eyes, ears, tongue. Tongue means, tongue as the organ of taste. Tongue as the organ of taste is an organ of perception. So the eyes, ears, the tongue, the nose and skin. Then the 5 organs of action are the hands, feet, again the tongue. Now the tongue as the organ of speech. The tongue as an organ of speech is a karmendriya. So hands, feet, tongue, the organs of evacuation and generation. So these make up the 10 sense organs. What we need to understand here is that the real sense organ, the eye for instance, is not this visible outer organ. The organ eye, it is a subtle thing. It is something made of very fine matter. It is invisible, but it functions through the physical instrument that we call the eye. So the organ of seeing doesn't mean the outer eyes, but an organ made of fine, intangible matter. It is one of the components of the subtle body, which is not destroyed at death. These sense organs don't function in sleep. During sleep, they are all gathered into the mind. The mind, as I said, is the central organ. In Vedanta, it is also called the inner organ, Antahkarana. Inner, Antahkarana is an organ. The organs of perception carry impressions to the mind. What the mind does is shape them into ideas. Not only that, it also changes these ideas into resolutions of the will. That is what the mind does. It processes perceptions and converts them into ideas and resolves. And this mind, the Antahkarana, the mind functions in 4 different phases. The one and the same mind, functioning in 4 modes. Depending on the mode of function, the one and the same inner organ is known by 4 different names. Manas, Buddhi, Chitta, Ahankara. The mode which creates uncertainty or doubt, that is called the mind. The mode which decides or determines or resolves the doubt, that is called intellect, buddhi. And the mode that acts as the storehouse of memory, this we know from Swamiji's Raja Yoga, that is called chitta, or the mind stuff. And the mode which produces I consciousness, which appropriates everything to itself and says I, that is the ego. So these are the 4 phases or modes of the same mind: Manas, Buddhi, Chitta and Ahankara. Let's try to get a clearer view. The mind is that function of the Antahkarana, the inner organ, which thinks, which deliberates, which considers the pros and cons of a situation. Überlegung auf Deutsch. That is the mind, or the function called the mind. The intellect, or the faculty, the ability of determining or ascertaining, that is a second function of the same mind by which doubts are resolved and a conclusion is reached. A conclusion is reached regarding the nature of an object. Feststellung. The mind stuff, or chitta, is the third function. All our memories, tendencies, they all rise from there, from the chitta. And the ego, or I consciousness, is the fourth function, which identifies the self with the not self, with the body mainly. So they're all just different functions of the same inner organ. So these functions are sometimes loosely described by the general term mind. Anyhow, according to Vedanta, even the mind is material. It is non-luminous in nature, because the mind is also produced from material elements. The mind is a product of Maya. This we heard last week. Primordial matter, Prakriti. Prakriti includes everything: inorganic, organic, and psychic. So, whatever is mental is also material. The luminosity, that is the capacity of illumining or manifesting an object, which the mind has, or which also seems to be a characteristic of the buddhi, chitta, and ahankara. All this luminosity is all borrowed from the self-luminous Atman, which is pure, unmixed, homogeneous consciousness. So strictly speaking, it is only the self, the Atman, that is self-luminous. Everything else is only, as they say, basking in borrowed glory. All that we have discussed up till now, the body, the sense organs, the mind, it is only the material aspect of the individualized soul, of the jiva, the material side of the jiva. But what is the power that keeps the soul's gross and subtle bodies alive? What is that? That is the prana, vital force. The vital force is a manifestation of cosmic energy inside the body. This is what keeps the body and mind alive, because it is active both in waking and in sleep. As I said, the body, the sense organs, the mind, all of them go to sleep at regular intervals, but not the vital force. It is always awake. Prana never goes to sleep. This vital force also, just for the sake of knowing, this vital force also has 5 separate functions. Respiration, carrying downward unassimilated food and drink, pervading the body and keeping it warm, ejecting the contents of the stomach through the mouth. That is also a function of this vital energy. And Lastly, conducting the soul from the body, leading the soul from the body at the time of death. This is the fourth. And carrying nutrition to every part of the body. So these are the 5 functions of prana. Respiration, carrying downward unassimilated food and drink, pervading the body, ejecting the contents of the stomach through the mouth, and conducting the soul from the body at the time of death. Lastly, carrying nutrition to every part of the body. These are the 5 functions of prana. So the 5 organs of action, 5 organs of perception, the 5 vital forces, and the mind in all its phases. All these components make up the subtle body. This subtle body accompanies the soul after death, when the gross physical body is destroyed. This is where all impressions left behind by action and thought, past and present, this is where everything is stored, and this determines the nature of the new physical body and the new mind when the soul is reborn. Then, in addition to the gross and subtle bodies, the soul possesses another causal body. This functions during deep sleep. All this you will know, you will learn in much greater detail in your study of Mandukya Upanishad. The nature of this causal body is described as unspecified ignorance or undifferentiated ignorance. We come across this term in the context of individual Maya, if you remember, Vyashti Maya. But we'll come again to this point a little later. All the various experiences of the waking and dream states, all our thoughts and feelings, our ideas, imaginations, memories and tendencies, everything disappears or subsides into this undifferentiated consciousness. Sometimes it is also called non-specific awareness, which is associated with the causal body. And out of it they appear again when the jiva emerges from deep sleep. We may compare the subtle body to a tree and the causal body to the seed. Just as the tree exists in the seed, where all its future diversities stay in potential form. In the same way, in deep sleep, the mind enters into a causal state where all its functions lie dormant. All its properties remain latent. It is all there, but we are not aware of it. The tree is involved in the seed and evolves out of it again. The evolution we see, but what is involved is invisible. That is why we say the seed is the cause of the tree. In the same way, the mind subsides into the causal body and emerges out of it again. And that is why the causal body is known as such, as the causal body. So much about the 3 bodies. Then Vedanta analyzes the non-self also into the 5 sheaths, the well-known koshas, pancha koshas. First of all, the Sthula, Sukshma and Karana Shariras, and then the Panchakoshas. The sheath of food, the sheath of the vital force, the sheath of the mind, the sheath of intelligence, and lastly, the sheath of bliss. They are called sheaths because, like a sheath covering a shining sword, they cover the self-luminous Atman. The sheaths are figuratively described as being one inside another, as if the sheath of food is the outermost and the sheath of bliss is the innermost. The grosser sheath is said to contain within it the finer sheath. But the point is, the finer sheath permeates the grosser. Please pay attention. The sheath of food is the outermost and the sheath of bliss is the innermost. The grossest is the outermost and the subtlest is the innermost. But the grosser the sheath, the grosser sheath contains within it the finer one, the finer sheath, and the finer sheath permeates the grosser sheath. So when it is said that the sheath of the vital force is inside the sheath of food, that Pranamaya Kosha is contained in the Annamaya Kosha, what is meant is that the vital sheath, which is finer than the physical sheath, it permeates or pervades it, it fills it. The Annamaya Kosha is permeated, saturates. The Annamaya Kosha is saturated with the Pranamaya Kosha. But the self, the Atman, is the finest entity. It is inside all the sheaths, and so this Atman, being the subtlest and the finest, that permeates all the sheaths. The light of the self shines through all the sheaths, but in varying degrees because of the varying density of these sheaths. The light of the self shines through the sheaths in varying degrees according to the density of the sheaths. So, the sheath of intelligence can reveal more of the self's luminosity than the sheath of the food. I hope you understood this. Because our ignorance, our avidya is persistent and stubborn, we identify the Atman with one or more of these 5 sheaths. The Vedic rishis and the great teachers of Vedanta describe their unreal, illusory nature in great detail and miss no opportunity to urge us, spiritual seekers, to negate these things and to cultivate a detachment from them, from the not self, from the 3 bodies and the 5 sheaths. Only when that is done, that is to say, when we cultivate total dispassion towards them through discrimination, only then the true nature of the self is revealed. So, let us now try to understand the nature and characteristics of the different sheaths. We'll study them in slightly more detail. First of all, The sheath of food, that is the gross physical body. As you can easily imagine, it is made of gross matter, produced by the combination of gross elements. It consists of flesh, bones, blood, and such other physical ingredients. This body is dependent upon food for its survival. It can only live as long as it can assimilate that food. And it becomes non-existent at the point of after death. It was non-existent before birth, and it again becomes non-existent after death. And during the intervening period, it is constantly changeable by nature. Its existence is short-lived, and all its qualities are temporary. So, the body cannot be the self, though we ignorantly identify it with the self. As long as we cling to this false identification, we can't go beyond death. We can't enjoy the bliss of freedom, no matter how knowledgeable we may be in philosophy. This is what Shankaracharya says in Viveka Chudamani. But it is not all negative. If the body is regarded as an instrument, only as an instrument for a higher purpose, then it can be a help to the self. Just as a house is helpful to one who dwells in it, how a vehicle is helpful to one who drives it. With the help of the physical body, we can practice spiritual disciplines, which would be impossible otherwise, and then rise above ignorance. As Sri Ramakrishna said, it is like a step ladder. We can't do without it, but once the purpose is served, we have to leave it behind. Then the sheath of the vital force, Pranamaya Kosha, that is finer than the Annamaya Kosha. This kosha is constituted by the fivefold, what we learned just now. The fivefold vital energy plus the five organs of action. This is something to remember. Pranamaya Kosha consists of prana, the pancha pranas, and the five organs of action. The hands, the feet, the tongue, the organs of evacuation and generation. This is what drives the body to action. When the self is identified with this sheath, with the Pranamaya Kosha, it manifests its rajasic nature, active nature. It is said to enter the body at the time of conception. This is what produces the feelings of hunger and thirst as long as the body is alive, and this leaves the body at the point of death, this Pranamaya Kosha. But being material in nature, it is also insentient, limited. So, the sheath of the vital force also cannot be the self. Then comes the sheath of the mind, which is finer than even the sheath of the vital force. Here, the power of willing, we all have it. Every living being has this power, the power of will. In psychology, it is called volitional faculty, Willensvermögen. The power of willing plus the five organs of perception. These together constitute the sheath of the mind. Manomaya Kosha, the power of willing, and the Pancha Jnanendriyas. When the self, when the Atman is identified with this Manomaya Kosha, it takes on the characteristics of the mind. It experiences the diversity of names and forms. It is this Manomaya Kosha that creates the idea of difference between the ego and the non-ego, of I and not I. All sense of distinction, difference exist in the mind alone. The phenomenal world, the outside world, is perceived to exist only because of the mind. This mind happens to be the seedbed of all desires. This is what impels the senses to activity in order to fulfill them. When it is roused by desires, the manas becomes aware of sense objects. And then it enjoys them, becomes attached to them. But when it is moved, when it is swayed by passion, like anger and greed, then the mind creates bondage. But again, not everything is negative. When it is freed from these passions, when it is purified, the same mind shows the way to moksha, to liberation. So the goal of all spiritual discipline is purification of the mind. And this is attained through the practice of viveka and vairagya, discrimination and dispassion. What I know to be unreal, I must have the power to give up. That is dispassion or renunciation. But all said, even the mind is a product of ignorance. The sheath of the mind, Manomaya Kosha, is also made up of fine material particles, which means it also has a beginning and an end. It is also subject to change. Not only that, it is also characterized by pleasure and pain. This is a matter of everyday experience for us. So, even the Manomaya Kosha, even that cannot be the self. Even the mind can't be the self. It belongs to the category of the object. The fourth one, the sheath of intelligence, Vijnanamaya Kosha, that is finer than the sheath of the mind. That is constituted by the power of knowing, the Pranamaya Kosha, and the power of action. The Manomaya Kosha has the power of willing, and the Vijnanamaya Kosha is constituted by the power of knowing or the cognitive faculty. Erkenntnisvermögen, together with the 5 organs of perception, the eyes, ears, tongue as the organ of taste, the nose and the skin. But then this sheath is also insentient because the intellect itself, as we learnt just a while ago, it is itself an organ. It is not consciousness, it is an organ. Like the ability to will, the ability to cognize, to know, also is a function. And a function can only belong to an organ. It is a mode of the same inner organ. So, even the Vijnanamaya Kosha, or the sheath of intelligence, is also matter. It appears intelligent, it appears conscious by itself because it is subtler and happens to be closer to the self than the other koshas. On account of that nearness to the Atman, on account of that nearness, it is able to reflect more of the intelligence of the self. It is this reflection of the Atman, which is called, strictly speaking, the individualized soul, the Jiva. When pure consciousness is limited by this Vijnanamaya Kosha, it appears as the individual soul or the phenomenal being. And the primary characteristic of any Jiva is this I consciousness. But that is also a limitation, this I consciousness. Because of that limitation of the I, the self, the Atman, forgets its true nature of infinity, of blessedness, and feels that it is an agent, that is, an actor, a doer, an enjoyer and experiencer of happiness and misery. And subject to the law of karma, it assumes different bodies determined by the desires of previous incarnations. Then it performs good and evil actions. So it is this soul which migrates from one body to another. Strictly speaking, the Vijnanamaya Kosha. So when the self is identified with the sheath of intelligence, it appears to be a doer or enjoyer in the relative world, the experiencer of its own good and evil actions. But remember, it is through ignorance that individuality, the I sense, is superimposed on the indivisible self. When that ignorance is destroyed by right knowledge, all such notions as the individualization of the self, ideas of its birth and death, everything ceases to exist. Just as the dream ego, which functions in sleep, just as the dream ego functioning in sleep vanishes when the dreamer awakes. So the false superimposition, which accounts for the individualized self, can be destroyed only by the right knowledge of the Atman or Brahman, and not by any other means. So, a living being has three main characteristics: knowledge, will, and activity. Cognition, volition, and action. The power of knowledge is a quality of the Vijnanamaya Kosha, the intelligent sheath. The power of will, through which an action is performed, that is the quality of the mental sheath, Manomaya Kosha. But no action is possible without vitality or energy. And this is the power of operation. The power of operation, which is a quality of the vital sheath, Pranamaya Kosha. When pure consciousness is limited by these three sheaths, the Pranamaya, Manomaya, and Vijnanamaya Koshas, then it becomes endowed with knowledge, will, and activity. So the division is made according to the respective properties of the sheaths. And these three sheaths together, this is something to remember. These three sheaths together make up the subtle body, which after death accompanies the soul in its transmigration. The first one we can forget. The gross body, the physical body. It is these three that are more important. These three together make up the subtle body, which does not die but accompanies the soul in its transmigration. So, one more kosha remains to be discussed, but we have run out of time. We'll take it up in our next class. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your participation.